modern day Israel. And then we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive on three of those empires: the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid Empire after its ruling family. So we're going to be doing so tell me, does everyone see these slides?
They're not, they're muted.
Oh, sorry,
You
but
can see it.
Yeah, we can see it. I'm not muted.
But does everyone see the slide?
Yes.
I think they do, yes.
Very good. All right. So as you can see, we're looking at an extremely crowded timeline. Some of these are very far back, right? We've got the ancient Israelites who, according to the Bible, arrived in the region of modern day Israel at the close of the Torah, when they cross over into the land of Israel. And we
Can you speak up louder, please?
Yes, absolutely. So we have these ancient Israelites, and right now we're on and at that point we're in a biblical timeline, right? But then at some point we sort of recorded history catches up, and that's when we get to the Assyrians. Around this time, the Israelites were divided into a northern and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was the living space of 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, which were traditionally the descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob. We had the 10 northern tribes and the two southern tribes. And the Assyrian Empire, as we'll see, took over the northern kingdom and exiled its inhabitants throughout the area, creating the 10 lost tribes, and brought the southern kingdom under vassalage. And then the Babylonian Empire conquers the Assyrian Empire and winds up sending this member, destroys the first temple, and sends the inhabitants of the southern kingdom as well into exile. Then we come to the Persians. The king of Persia allows the Jews to return to their homelands. A handful of them do. Many of them form communities across the land of the former Babylonian Empire, the current at the time Persian Empire. And then, of course, we have the conquests of, who's Randall Snowling? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, it says Randall Snowling is controlling my screen.
What's that mean? Do you need any help?
Sure, one moment. I'm going to stop share and then restart share and see if that changes anything.
If it's a Zoom bomber mode, we're going to have to close it.
All right, I believe that should have solved it. But let me hop back to our initial slide. So at the time, and here for the Macedonian/Seleucids, that's when we reach the time of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great mounts this enormous conquest across what the time was essentially the entirety of the known world, right, in the Near East. Like, he dominates the Near East, pushing as far east as modern-day India, and that includes Israel. Alexander the Great's empire crumbles slowly after its death, split among his 3 generals, and one of those generals takes over the area that used to be the Persian Empire. And he starts the Seleucid dynasty. Now, some of us know the Seleucid dynasty because of the most famous member of that dynasty, Antiochus, who, as you know, is the antagonist of our Hanukkah story, which brings us to the Hasmoneans. The rebellion against Antiochus winds up creating a temporarily independent Jewish power, the Hasmonean Empire. And the Hasmonean Empire lasts for a fairly short time, because even as the Seleucid Empire is in its decline, the Roman Empire is in its ascent.
Try a different device, maybe?
I'm sorry? Oh, sorry. The Roman Empire is in its ascent, and the Hasmonean Empire gets brought under the rule of King Herod, a puppet leader of the Romans, and subsequently amalgamated into the Roman Empire proper as the province of Judea, later the province of Palestine, after a series of rebellions lead to an extremely antagonistic relationship between the Jews and the Romans. Shortly thereafter, not shortly, centuries thereafter, the Roman Empire essentially converts and divides, and the area of modern-day Israel is brought underneath the Byzantine Empire, Christian power. And the Byzantines play host to an incredible amount, and the Byzantines are incredibly anti-Jewish. They wind up using the spot of the former Second Temple destroyed underneath the Romans as a garbage dump. They persecute Jews horribly, to the point where after the first Muslim caliphate, the Rashidun Caliphate, led by Muhammad, and following that by Muhammad's immediate successors as caliphs, which is the title for the ruler of the whole Muslim community, or the Ummah. And the Rashidun Caliphate takes over the area, constructs the dome of the rock, and brings the area of modern-day Israel under an era of Muslim domination that'll last through several consecutive empires. It'll last through the Seljuk Turks, after the repulsions of the Crusaders, through the Mamluks, a dynasty of former slave soldiers that rose up through Egypt and ultimately conquered the area of modern-day Israel, and subsequently through the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Israel for 400 years, until the Ottoman Empire crumbled in the fallout of World War I. Israel was brought under the British Mandate, and subsequently, the rest of this story. But my main point in putting this slide forward is just to indicate just how many flags have flown above Israel over the course of these millennia. Now let's do a bit of a deeper dive on one of those empires that I mentioned. I called it the Assyrian Empire, but of course it's a little bit more complicated than that. To talk about the origins of the Assyrian Empire, we have to go all the way back to the city-states of Sumer, in what was known as the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia is an area of modern-day Iraq that in about 4000 BCE was incredibly fertile. One moment. And Mesopotamia at the time had extremely good soil, incredibly fertile, and ultimately played host to some of the first cities in the world. And I know that's an incredible designation, but some of those cities had names like Ur, like Lagash, and they were a series of independent city-states that propped up around. Can everyone see my mouse? Just put a thumbs up if you can see my mouse moving around.
Yes, it's
Perfect.
small, but it's there.
So the area that I'm circling right here on this map of the Assyrian Empire is about the area of the Fertile Crescent, and city-states proliferated across all of these rivers, benefiting from the good soil and frequently going to war against each other. Now ultimately, some of these city-states turn into powerful empires. Around the end of this period of the city-states, we have the rise of the Achaemenid Empire, known as the world's first empire, that conquers a number of Sumerian city-states and ultimately gains a power center right around here. And during this time, the city of Assur, one of these many city-states, One of these many city-states is kind of ignored during the Achaemenid Empire, but after the Achaemenid Empire collapses, it embarks on a series of expansions, taking over neighboring city-states before being forced down again. And that was the time period of the First Assyrian Empire. There's also a Second Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire that winds up entering history due to its conquest of the Northern Kingdom is actually the third and ultimately the last Assyrian Empire. And so the Third Assyrian Empire, as noted, rose from that Sumerian city-state and was the most powerful state in the world. The Emperor Tiglath-Pileser during one of a multi-generational during one of like a multi-generational era of expansion that winds up taking the Assyrian Empire way out of Mesopotamia. The Emperor Tiglath-Pileser, following up on the conquest of the northern kingdom that forced the Jews into exile, brings the southern kingdom under vassalage as well. So we have an era where the northern kingdom has essentially been dispersed across the Assyrian Empire, creating the 10 lost tribes, which go on to become an incredibly powerful cultural symbol for centuries in Jewish myths, to the point where sometimes, like over the centuries, when a new isolated Jewish community is discovered, like even the Ethiopian Jews, they'll sometimes be said, oh, they might be descendants of the 10 lost tribes. So the dispersal of the 10 lost tribes creates an incredibly sad and incredibly potent cultural symbol. But even the two tribes who were living in what was then the southern kingdom in the area that I'm circling right here, they were also brought under Assyrian domination. Now the Assyrian Empire rules for a very long time and accomplishes a lot of enormous military feats, even bringing Egypt in as a subject kingdom. The Assyrians actually install a puppet dynasty in Egypt, that is to say, a dynasty that they essentially indirectly controlled. And and as you can see, Egypt is here colored as a subject kingdom. But the Assyrians ultimately collapsed into enormous, devastating civil war. 3 kings each laid claim to the Assyrian throne, fought an incredibly devastating civil war that weakened the empire. We had the Medes and Babylonians in this area rebel, push west, push into the empire. From this region, some ancient tribes of horsebound marauders known as the Scythians and Cimmerians march south, devastate this area of the kingdom, and ultimately, sensing the weakness of the Assyrian Empire, the 26th dynasty of Egypt, that puppet dynasty, actually breaks away from Assyria altogether. So over time, Assyria loses its subject kingdoms, loses a lot of its military might, becomes incredibly exposed, and is rapidly conquered by the Medians and Babylonians as they push west. The last king of Assyria ultimately flees Nineveh, the capital, and at that time one of the last 2 cities under Assyrian domination, and he flees to the way south to the border town of Haran, where he is ultimately driven out by the Babylonians, and that ends the third and last Assyrian Empire. Now let's move on to the ultimately not terribly long-lived empire that succeeded them, the Babylonian Empire. Like Assyria, Babylonia essentially rose out of one of those old Mesopotamian city-states. You can see circling Babylon right here. And Babylonia, unlike Assyria, doesn't bring Judah in as a vassal kingdom. Babylonia absorbs Judah altogether. Judah was the name of the southern kingdom at the time, and it sends the people in the southern kingdom out all the way across the Babylonian Empire. Unlike under the Assyrians, these aren't lost tribes. They're still a solid Jewish identity now, just spread across the Babylonian Empire, but they are sent into exile. And much like the 10 lost tribes, that ultimately too is a very painful moment in Jewish history, especially since the first temple, the holiest site in Judaism, was destroyed by the advancing Babylonians. However, this Babylonian exile also begins the era of diaspora Judaism, which is to say, like the rise of Jews outside the area of modern day Israel. Ultimately, though, the Babylonian Empire doesn't last terribly long, and that's for a couple of reasons. The Babylonian Empire rises to power because of a very diverse military coalition, right? It's allied with the Medes, it's allied a little with the Persians, it benefits from these northern horsebound marauders. So basically, like the Babylonian victory, the Babylonians owe a lot to a lot of people, and ultimately the Babylonian Empire doesn't wind up being governed by terribly smart diplomats. leader of the Babylonian Empire, despite his new incredibly diverse and incredibly fragile empire, immediately moves to consolidate all religion into the temple of Marduk at Babylon, bringing in like religious icons from all across not only Mesopotamia but across the Babylonian Empire to that temple, attempting to centralize local religions under his priests. And by doing that, he angers folks in essentially every single city other than Babylon. And all the while, he's not exactly. And meanwhile, because he's this very non-military project of centralizing Babylonian religion, he's not cultivating the links he needs to be cultivating with the military. So ultimately, you have an empire that's riven by internal dissent and extremely militarily exposed. And that's a phenomenal opportunity for Cyrus the Great, a Persian ruler who at the time has just who has just mounted an incredibly successful rebellion against the Median Empire in the east. And Cyrus the Great rapidly pushes west, overwhelms the Babylonians, and founds the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire is also known as the Achaemenid Empire because of the Achaemenid dynasty that essentially governs over the Persian Empire from the time of Cyrus the Great right up until the last emperor of Persia, who Alexander the Great defeats. So this was a 2-century reign. And one of Cyrus's first actions was permitting the Jews to return to their homeland. Now, most Jews don't take him up on that offer, which is crucial. Those Jews stay in their homes where they've become accustomed over the span of the Babylonian Empire, but a number of Jews do opt to return to the era of modern-day Israel, and they celebrate Cyrus. The very interesting fact is that Cyrus is the only non-Jew ever to be referred to as Moshiach or Messiah. That was the extent of his reverence among the Jews who choose to return to Israel. Now the Persian Empire essentially learns a lot of lessons from the Babylonians about the necessity of creating a government that's that's strong, well organized, and respectful of individual cultures. And they create what's now essentially known as the first modern administrative state. They create a number of extremely modern innovations. They create standardized gold and silver coinage. They create administrative areas, creating between 20 and 30 satraps who are imperially appointed governors to reign over different areas, and to do so while respecting the area's local religion, while using the area's local language. The Persian Empire itself uses, kind of like the European Union, uses a lot of different languages at its own court. It puts forward documents in Elamite and in Akkadian and in Aramaic and in Old Persian and in a number of languages that vary based on the province where that information is being distributed. They create postal offices. They create massive trade networks, building out a highway of 2,500 kilometers. That's slightly over 1,500 miles, and they use that to stimulate cross-imperial trade. Now, note that this is an empire that extends all the way from modern-day Pakistan to modern-day Macedonia. So this is an incredible feat, and they are so successful at it that trade tariffs become one of their primary means of revenue. So there's so much trade going on this road that the extent that the cut that they're taking out of trade profits is nearly equivalent to all of the amount that they're getting in taxes from all of these satraps. So they build this modern administrative state, and it's intensely successful. And they have now Persian culture is essentially characterized by the incredibly large realm that they ruled. Their architecture was extremely eclectic, including Median elements, Persian elements, Babylonian elements. They were also marked by religious tolerance. Like the way that they treated the Jews was by no means was by no means individual, although the Persian Empire itself though the Persian Empire itself winds up taking up Zoroastrianism, a religion that spreads throughout Iran initially and is ultimately adopted and put forward by the Achaemenid rulers. It's never to the exclusion of other faiths. Actually, when we talk about Zoroastrianism is actually one of the most interesting things about the Persian Empire, because it's adopted by the Achaemenid rulers to such an extent that it becomes deeply interwoven with the Persian Empire's identity. Zoroastrianism was a semi-monotheistic religion. It was a dualist religion, and essentially what it believed in was essentially a balancing of light and dark spirits. The light spirits, essentially governed by a godlike entity, Ahura Mazda, that was an eternal conflict against an about equally strong Angramenu that represent the dark, the negative, and that sort of core conflict was one in which humans could essentially play a role, right? Like good deeds assisted essentially the god of good against his nearly co-equal god of evil. And this is a fascinating theology, right? And it spreads widely, but ultimately, although it's largely overwhelmed by Islam in the millennia to follow, it'll be incredibly prominent in the Iranian region for millennia to come. And there's actually a community of Zoroastrians today, both in both in Iran and in India. And you'll actually never guess you actually might be surprised by the largest city of Zoroastrians outside of Iran or India. It's Los Angeles. So it's kind of caught on around a very specific, it's caught on among, so there's that legacy community in Iran, that legacy community in India, and it's caught on among a very specific sector of Californians. So that's just a little fun fact. But ultimately, this empire is conquered by Alexander the Great. So that's sort of a deeper dive into three of the empires that governed over modern day Israel during ancient times. And yeah, I'd love to take any questions that anyone has. Oh, you're one moment. I think that you're muted.
Yeah.
All right. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Los Angeles.
Was this the end of your presentation, or do you have more slides coming?
Oh no, this was the end of the presentation. The intent was just to do a deeper dive on a smaller number of empires.
If this is the end, and you are going to entertain questions, perhaps we should just go into a different view.
Oh, yes, sure. My apologies.
Remove the slide so people can see. Okay, here we go. And then unmute all. Okay. Everyone should be unmuted. So either can do it by chat or just directly raise your hand for questions. And Gail, if you'd be so kind, is going to be responsible for the questions.
Yeah, if you would let me know through chat, I can, because we can't see everybody on the one screen.
No, we're unmuted.
Did Fran Shapiro have her hand up? And someone marked iPad has her hand up. She's unmuted if you want to ask your question.
Okay, I'm iPad. I haven't figured out how to put my name there yet. Thank you for this presentation. This is one of my areas of study with ancient history. I came to it from a love of Latin, which I used to teach, and then I just kept going backwards and backwards and backwards. And you sound so enthusiastic about your subject. I'm wondering if you've had the great privilege of walking any of these grounds that you've talked about.
What did she say?
That's a great question. I've been
Because I'm
in.
envious, if you have.
I'm afraid I haven't. I've never been to the areas of Mesopotamia or Iran where many of these empires sprung from, but I have gone to Israel numerous times, and because all of these areas were at one point under the domination of each of these empires, you'll see many times wandering through Israel a Babylonian ruin, a Persian ruin,
Mhm.
and even many of these later empires, like you'll see the marks of these empires on the local architecture. Just as an example, right? The Mamluk Empire, which, as I mentioned, were the descendants of former slave soldiers that took over Egypt and subsequently Israel. They were under an incredibly restrictive regime that said, all right, any wealth that you cultivate over the course of your life that isn't bound up in your home immediately goes not to your children, but back to the Mamluk regime itself. And ultimately, as you can imagine, what that resulted in was a number of incredibly ornate homes in the old city, built with incredibly valuable materials, with an enormous amount of work put into them. So you can just walk down the street and go left, and you'll see something in like the Mamluk architectural style that's incredibly ornate, like very well carved, stands up and is essentially like an incredible sight right up until this day, even though it might have been built 800 years ago. And you'll immediately say, yeah, that's essentially that's the result of this particular imperial policy. So each of them have left their mark on the Israeli architecture, although I can't say I've ever been privileged enough to be in any of the areas that were their capitals.
Mo,
There's a wonderful exhibit in the Berlin Museum on Babylon, including the Gate of Ishtar.
Nice. Oh, does anyone?
I have a few questions that people have sent through chat. Do you want a couple of them?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, Mo, the first question from Nina. Well, let me first go to Ellen Klein's question. Would you repeat the definition of excuse me, but I can't pronounce the whole.
Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrianism was what's known as a dualist religion, which means that it paid a lot of attention, which meant that it believed that the world was essentially in the middle of an eternal war between sort of the forces of good and the forces of evil. And the forces of good were governed by a being called Ahura Mazda, which was like the Zoroastrian analog to God. And Ahura Mazda and the forces of good, known as Spent-Emanu, were constantly in battle against the forces of evil, known as Angra-Mainyu, and that human tasks could essentially make things slightly easier for Spent-Emanyu's ultimate victory. And even though that's like a very shallow dive into their theology, it's worth noting that this was like the religion of an empire for many centuries, and the religion of the Iranian people right up until the rise of Islam in about around the year 600. So it becomes this incredibly complicated theology. We have messianic elements there. The idea that being known as the Saoshyama would eventually emerge from human descent and aid the forces of Spent-Emanu. They had the idea of an afterlife, which is, hey, if you're good and righteous, then Ahura Mazda will recognize you for contributions, and you'll get this and you'll get this incredible afterlife. And you even had these like kind of odd denominations splitting off. You had the Zervinists, who believed that both Ahura Mazda and Engramenu were created by a neutral being that predated both Zerva, and that actually became very prominent in the much later Sassanid Empire, which governed over the areas of modern day Iran. So it's a really fascinating religion. It's one of a number of dualistic religions that propagated during this period. You also had Manichaeism, which was very similar in the sense that it talked a lot about the idea of, hey, there's a massive battle going on between the force of good and evil, and what that essentially is universe expanding, and in which humans can play a part. And Manichaeism was essentially later than Zoroastrianism, really caught on in Central Asia and for a short while in Western China. But both of these were dualistic traditions that were incredibly prominent for many centuries.
Okay, Mo, I have one more. Could you, from Helen, could you please talk some more about the Jews who left Persia when when Cyrus allowed it, and those who chose not to? Did those who stayed remain to form the Jewish community of Iran?
Yes, absolutely. So in part because of the Babylonian exile, and in part because of subsequent exiles that might have driven the Jews out of modern day Israel, essentially like successive exiles from Israel and the Jews that chose not to return formed the Jewish communities in Iran, in the Near East, that is to say, like, Syria, Iraq, right. So everywhere really everywhere that there are Jews that isn't in Israel, and most Jews that are in Israel actually at one point participated in one of these exiles, or are obviously descended from the Jews who did.
Okay, one more here from Carl Sheffer to everyone, or to Mo. Did the Jews spread throughout the Persian Empire who chose not to return to Israel form up into Jewish communities?
To tell you the truth, I'm not sure, but I believe that the Jews who chose to remain in Babylon still continued on with their Jewish tradition and did so throughout the Persian Empire as well.
Okay, I think that's it for the questions right now.
Rich Bergman requested to ask a question.
Oh, here.
And Toby.
Toby, I didn't see.
Oh, Moses, thank you very much. Can you hear me? I had a couple of questions about Zoroastrianism. How do they get their name? You sort of answered one. I wanted to know whether they believe in heaven and hell. We kind of answered that, yes. And did the government over those 200 years use the religion to help control the people?
So as mentioned, they did believe in an afterlife that was determined on actions in life. For the way they got their name, I know this is kind of another question, because how did he get the name? But it's named after the Zoroastrians' initial prophet, known as Zoroaster, and that's actually anglicized as Zarathustra. If you've ever, that's the source of Friedrich Nietzsche's famous book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The main character is essentially there to represent that Zoroastrian prophet. So that was how they got their name. For how the Persian rulers absolutely used the Zoroastrian religion to control the people. The Persian rulers put a lot of effort into amalgamating the Iranian pantheon into Zoroastrianism to essentially take this new religion and use it to help sort of mandate order across the empire. The Persian emperor was and for many centuries, being the heir to Babylon was seen as the seat of the heir to Babylon, the defender of Marduk, chief god of the Babylonians was seen as like, all right, this man has the right to rule. And and Cyrus actually says, okay, Marduk was very mad that when he takes over, he says, all right, Marduk was very mad that the Babylonians took all of these regional gods into his temple. Marduk was very mad. This like unbalanced the cosmos, and Marduk has sent me to avenge him against the Babylonians. But so this is how Cyrus kind of gets that initial legitimacy. But over time, Zoroastrianism kind of fills the gap, like the Achaemenids depict themselves as kind of like tools of Ahura Mazda.
Thank you, Moses.
Well, there's another question here, if you have time for this one. When did the land of Israel, from Denise, start to form separate from other countries?
That's a great question. So it's worth noting that when we're going through empires of Israel, there is a continual Jewish presence in the land, right? But for a very, 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 very long time, it's extremely small. When we talk about, hey, what were the Jews in modern day Israel getting up to during the Ottoman Empire? A lot, right? Like they write a lot of like very critical pieces of theology, like the Shulchan Aruch. There are a number of yeshivas throughout the land of Israel. The critical thing is this is a community of only 10,000 Jews. And just as like some context on that, there's 60,000 Jews in Houston. So like that's a very, very tiny Jewish population. Essentially Jews, the majority of Jews aren't the descendants of those Jews that were in modern day Israel during the Ottoman period. It's European Jews, later of course, like Jews from the Middle East, Russian Jews that come into Israel and form the backbone of the area's modern Jewish community. So the land of Israel sort of becomes a majority Jewish land essentially when Jews start traveling there en masse throughout the consecutive Aliyot.
Mo, you should know that there are a lot of compliments being sent on the chat. I'll let you read them later.
Toby Halpern had her hand up.
Okay,
Oh, hi, Toby. Sorry.
Moses, you obviously have a prodigious knowledge of these ancient empires.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing it with us. I am curious, did you develop this interest in this body of knowledge as a result of a course at college, or because of your love for Israel, which of course you come by naturally?
I haven't taken a college course centered upon the Near East, but I did days of research when I was initially writing up my curriculum for the Sunday school class, and I've drawn a lot from that. I also learned a lot when I was in Israel over several trips, read a series of books on the subject, sort of both to prepare me for those trips and, like when I was there and later to sort of make sense of them. But I've got to say a lot of stuff I just picked up from my parents, as you can imagine. Thank you so much.
Another question, I think. Given the political domination by others over many centuries, how have the Jewish communities tracked their heritage? And another thank you for the stimulating presentation, which I think lots of people are saying.
I really, really, really wish I could answer that question, but the truth is that there's a lot I don't know about how Jewish communities located throughout the diaspora tracked their heritage over the centuries. Dad, yes, thank you.
Yes, I just want to ask, like, how
the
can you
cavalry.
be so wonderful? No, that wasn't my question. The question I want to ask is, Toby addressed my first question, which is, where does this come from? And it comes from your own intellectual curiosity. And I feel like you just kind of went down rabbit holes of learning, or you were interested in something, so you read more about it and more about it and more about it. So in your research and investigation, look, the Jews feel very, we love Cyrus because he freed us. We hate the Babylonians because they imprisoned us. But you give sort of this dispassionate look at who were these empires, where did they come from? It's not all about us. They just happen to conquer us, but they have their own beginning and their own end. Who do you admire? Who impressed you with these empires? And what about them was about some of these empires did you find especially intriguing? I love that anecdote about the Mamelukes having, putting their money in buildings because that's their only way to preserve their wealth. Were there other tidbits of interest that really stimulated you to want to just read more about any of these empires?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of what empires I admire, I mean, I really don't know. I mean, I think a lot of empires that have governed over has also made, incredible advancements in governing, like the Persian Empire, the Persian Empire certainly, the even the Rashidun Caliphate, the Roman Empire, all of these empires are sort of, sort of bring a I guess this is a weird way of putting it, but they kind of sped up history, right? Like they took in advancements that we today take for granted, that they incorporated them into their government at sort of incredibly rapid clips. But one moment. So in terms of which empire, some fun historical facts that kind of really want to take deep dives into these empires. Sort of thing, it's really easy to take just the series of empires and try to turn those into grand overarching historical ideas. Philosopher Hegel, for instance, predicated a lot of his philosophies on the empires that held successive domination in the Near East, said, all right, the Persian loss in the Greco-Persian War, and sort of had a mantle of civilization passing from the strict order of the Persians to sort of the free thought of the Greeks. But these are incredibly complicated empires, right? The Babylonian morals, for example, are so different from our own that it's really hard to think of them as coherent Salah, right? They had slavery for debtors. They had slavery for debtors. They had incredibly strict property laws, but at the same time they had, and this is wild, they had not only did they have total right, they had no penalties at all for engaging in homosexual activity, and they had public recognition of non-binary individuals as well. So it's really interesting to note that almost nothing is a new development. There's always some interesting corresponding equivalent from a civilization that came upon it many millennia before. Nothing's a straight line is what I'm.
What are you studying, Moses?
I'm doing a double major in math, econ, and statistics.
When you get an investment, I want you to call me.
Yeah.
I think we all feel that way.
I have a question. Oh,
You're on mute.
Also, I misspoke. The one I was talking about wasn't the Babylonians, it was the Assyrians.
Moses, was there any influence by the ancient empires that influenced the Israelites' music, art, culture?
Wait, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?
Did the Assyrians influence the Jewish people in any way, in music and art?
The Assyrians. That's a really interesting question. The easy way is of course they influenced the Jewish community. They essentially they essentially subdivided it into two. But I think Assyrian influence was sort of limited over the Jewish communities compared to like the empires that came after, just because, you know, the Jews that were amalgamated into the Assyrian Empire essentially vanished from the historical record there, right? And and what you have is the conversion of the Southern Kingdom into like a vassal kingdom that absolutely, you know, despises their Assyrian oppressors. So I think that might lower sort of cultural permeation relative to, say, the Babylonian Empire, where these Jews leave the Babylonian Empire, but subsequently return like a century plus later. So I couldn't give you specific answers on on how the Assyrians affected the Jewish community, but I think it's possible that there was sort of less, you know, less opportunity for interaction there than there would be with, you know, an empire where that empire was in direct control of that Jewish area, but permitted Jewish culture to proliferate in that region.
You have another question here, Marley's.
Yeah, following up on Howie Friedman's question, I was wondering, with all the diasporas, I don't know if that's the plural of diaspora or whether it should end in an AE, but anyhow, I was wondering, did any of the cultures influence Judaism so that today we look back to certain things that we're doing and they actually came from Persia, from Assyria, from wherever?
I gotta tell you that, you know, that like those empires' effects on Jewish practices, like, yes. All right, Dad has offered to address that, and that is far more up his alley. So I'm gonna pass the torch from him.
Of all of these, first of all, of course, every empire that ruled over this land affected us and influenced us, and some of our neighbors where we live side by side did. But among the empires that he described today, I would say the most influential were the Persians and Zoroastrianism, which had a clear influence on the development of Judaism. And you can see it as a line in the Bible, pre-Persian Empire, post-Persian Empire, where that influence is. So those of you who were at lunch with the rabbi about 2 years ago, we dedicated a session that showed how the ancient priests, one of their articles of clothing was influenced by the Persians, because initially the priests did not wear pants, they wore skirts. And then by the end of Leviticus is done, they're wearing pants, which was a Persian clothing article. So clearly the Persians had an influence before the book of Leviticus was complete, because by the end of Leviticus, the priests are wearing pants. Secondly, the biggest influence of Zoroastrianism in the Jewish tradition will come primarily through the prophet Isaiah, who was deeply influenced by the dualism that Mo described, the fight between good and evil, the forces of good and the forces of evil, would become one of Isaiah's principal themes, and it's clearly influenced from the Zoroastrians. It's interesting, Jews have tend to move away from that in modern times, whereas some Christians are very much into the devil fighting against the forces of good that Jews aren't so interested in, but Isaiah was. And also, it seems our belief in the eternal soul and afterlife in the way we understand that was influenced by the Zoroastrians that Moses has described so well.
There's one more comment here that so many people have sent you thank you and how good you are, but I have to read this one. It says, Moses, you have an incredible vocabulary.
Such. All right. Yeah, I just wanted to also, looks like that's the tail end of the question. So I just wanted to say thank you all so much for coming. And yeah, this was a real pleasure.
And you're such a gracious reader. You absorb everything you read, and it just pops out of your mouth when somebody asks a question.
Moses, again, thank you so very much. On behalf of the Israel Committee, I want to express my profound gratitude. And on behalf of all the members of Temple who were fortunate enough to participate tonight. So yes, as we all say, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
And Hag Sameach, everybody. Happy Hanukkah, Hag Sameach.
And can I make
Yes,
an
Rabbi.
announcement too? And also, if I could ask our host not to close the session in case people want to stick around and chat. Is that all right?
Sure.
Don't forget to pick up your free gift this Thursday from 4:30 to 5:30, a present from the temple. Ethel Gross, are you on the call somewhere? You were earlier, I don't see at the moment. Ethel has, and her whole committee have prepared goodies for you to come and pick up between 4:30 and 5:30 this Thursday, and stay for 5:30 for the lighting of the temple's new enormous outdoor menorah.
Thanks for the plug.
Yes.
Oh, and Ethel, don't go because I have a question for you about that.
I'm here.
But this was amazing. Thank you, Israel Committee.
Thank you, Israel Committee. Thank you, Nina.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi Elaine. It was your idea, and luckily your son graciously accepted.
Yay. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses.
Thank you.
Thank you, Moses.
Moses, so much.
Thank you.
Will the speaker stay on so we can ask him personal questions?
Just give him a handkerchief to wipe his brow.
I can't even pronounce what he's majoring in.
It's nice watching the parents quell.
Yes.
Yeah.
And grandparents.
And
Oh,
grandmothers there.
Wonderful.
I don't know if one or both grandmothers are there.
Yeah. I really am curious, Mo. What are you studying?